The gray, weeping sky over the town of Oakhaven seemed to bleed directly into the stained concrete of the Oakview apartments, a place where hope came to curdle. Arthur Miller was on his knees in the building's breezeway, scrubbing at a dark, sticky stain left by a leaking garbage bag. The cheap pine-scented cleaner did little to mask the smell of decay that was baked into the very foundation of the place. At 42, Arthur moved with the deliberate, aching slowness of a man much older. His knuckles were raw, his back a knot of persistent fire, but his motions were economical, honed by years of simply enduring. His clothes, a faded pair of work pants and a thin gray t-shirt, were worn but immaculately clean, a small, defiant act of order in a world of chaos. He was a ghost in this building, a janitor who materialized to clean up the messes of others and then vanished back into the anonymity of apartment 3B. He was seen but never acknowledged, a piece of the building's dreary infrastructure, like a humming fluorescent light or a perpetually dripping faucet. The stain, a deep, ugly purple from spilled grape soda, was stubborn. As he worked the brush in tight circles, the bristles scraping against the rough concrete, he heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps of his landlord, Mr. Henderson. Henderson was a man whose physical bulk was matched only by the weight of his own self-importance. He stopped beside Arthur, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the grime Arthur was trying to erase. "Miller." Henderson's voice was slick with condescension. "Still behind?" I hear. He didn't wait for an answer. He nudged a crumpled fast food bag with the toe of his expensive shoe, pushing it closer to Arthur. "Get that too. This place is starting to look like the people who live in it." Arthur didn't look up. He felt the heat of shame creep up his neck, a familiar burn. He simply nodded, his jaw a tight, hard line. "Yes, sir." The words were gravel in his throat. From the open doorway of their apartment, his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, watched. She was a small, fierce thing, with her mother's bright, intelligent eyes and a spirit that hadn't yet been crushed by the grayness of Oakhaven. She saw the way Henderson loomed over her father, the way her father seemed to shrink, to fold into himself. Her small hands, clutching the worn fabric of her dress, tightened into fists. She hated Mr. Henderson. She hated the way he made her strong, quiet father look so small. Arthur could feel her gaze on him, and it was a heavier weight than the landlord's scorn. He was supposed to be her shield, her protector. But here, on his knees, he felt more like a target. His entire existence had been distilled into this single, humiliating loop. Work, clean, apologize, and endure. He finished with the soda stain, the concrete now a clean, pale circle in a sea of dirt, a tiny, temporary victory. He reached for the fast food bag, the grease seeping through the thin paper onto his fingers. Inside his mind, a quiet mantra played over and over, a prayer he'd recited for years. For her. Just get through today for her. He had to protect her not just from the world's dangers, but from its casual cruelties, even if it meant absorbing them all himself. He was a dam holding back a flood of indignity, and he could feel the pressure building, the tiny cracks beginning to form in his resolve. The breezeway was cold, but Arthur was sweating. The next afternoon, the conflict arrived in a more volatile form. Greg Henderson, the landlord's son, swaggered into the courtyard as if he owned the very air the tenants breathed. He was a cheap copy of his father, the same arrogance, but without the thin veneer of civility. Greg was 25, built like a high school football player who'd let himself go to seed. His face perpetually flushed with cheap beer and unearned confidence. He was here, as he often was, to do his father's dirty work, a task he relished with a bully's glee. He spotted Arthur replacing a burnt-out bulb in a courtyard light fixture, standing precariously on a wobbly step stool. "Miller!" Greg's voice cut through the quiet afternoon hum. "Dad sent me to collect. You're 2 weeks late. Or did you forget how to count along with how to pay your bills?" A few neighbors were on their porches, soaking in the weak afternoon sun. Mrs. Gable from 2B, a woman whose curtains were always twitching, paused her knitting. A couple of teenagers loitering by the mailboxes looked over, sensing the potential for drama. Their silence was an audience, and Greg played to it. Arthur descended the stool carefully, his movements measured. He didn't want a confrontation. Not here. Not with Lily's window overlooking the courtyard. "I spoke to your father," Arthur said, his voice low and even. "I get paid Friday. He'll have it then." "Friday?" Greg laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "This isn't a charity, old man. My father isn't running a home for washed-up losers." He stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space, forcing him to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. The difference in their size and age was stark. "What do you even do all day? Scrub floors? You're a janitor, living in my father's building. You should be grateful we let you stay this long." Arthur's gaze remained steady, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He could smell the stale beer on Greg's breath. "Please, Greg, let's not do this out here." His eyes flickered toward his daughter's window, a silent plea. The plea only emboldened Greg. He saw the flicker of fear, the desperate attempt to protect his child, and he zeroed in on it like a predator. "What's the matter? Don't want your kid to see what a failure her old man is." He gave Arthur a hard shove in the chest. It wasn't enough to knock him down, but it sent him stumbling back a step. The step stool wobbled and crashed to the ground. The sound was loud in the quiet courtyard. Arthur caught his balance, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't retaliate. He just stood there, absorbing the humiliation, his face a mask of stony control. The neighbors watched, their faces impassive. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. They were just spectators at the slow, painful dismantling of a man's dignity. Greg smirked, victorious. "That's what I thought," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Nothing. You're nothing." He turned and walked away, leaving Arthur standing alone in the center of the courtyard, the fallen stool at his feet, the weight of a dozen silent, judging eyes pressing down on him. He felt stripped bare, his poverty and his powerlessness laid out for all to see. That night, the small apartment felt like a fortress under siege. Arthur sat in the dark long after he'd tucked Lily into bed. Her question from earlier echoed in the suffocating silence. "Daddy, why didn't you hit him back? You're stronger than him." He hadn't known how to answer her. How could he explain that the truest strength wasn't in throwing a punch, but in restraining the overwhelming urge to do so? How could he tell his innocent daughter that her father was a man who had seen enough violence to last a dozen lifetimes, and that he feared the monster within himself far more than any loud-mouthed bully? His gaze drifted to the closet, where a small, locked footlocker sat tucked away beneath a pile of old blankets. He didn't need to open it. He knew its contents by heart. A folded American flag, crisp and sacred. A set of dog tags cool against the skin. A bronze star and a purple heart, their ribbons still vibrant, their weight a paradox of honor and agony. And photos. Photos of young men with old eyes, smiling in the blinding Iraqi sun. Men who were now just names on a wall, ghosts who walked with him in the quiet hours of the night. His mind didn't conjure specific firefights or explosions anymore. Instead, it was the sensory details that haunted him. The roar of a Humvee engine, a sound so similar to the motorcycles that sometimes tore through town. The gritty taste of sand that got into everything. The suffocating heat. The weight of his rifle, of his body armor, of the responsibility for the lives of the men under his command. He had been Sergeant Arthur Miller then. A man respected, a man followed. A man who knew how to make life-or-death decisions in the blink of an eye. He knew precisely how to disable a man like Greg Henderson. He could break his nose with the heel of his palm. He could dislocate his shoulder with a simple, brutal twist. He knew 17 ways to end a fight before the other person even knew it had begun. And that knowledge terrified him. The violence he had been trained to master was a beast he now kept leashed and starved in the deepest part of his soul. Unleashing it on a pathetic bully like Greg would be a betrayal of the control he had fought so hard to maintain since coming home. It would be an insult to the memory of the men who didn't get to come home at all. His restraint wasn't weakness. It was a penance. It was a shield not for him but for everyone else. He was protecting Greg from himself. He was protecting Lily from seeing what her father was truly capable of. He pressed the heels of his hands into his tired eyes, the ghosts whispering around him. He had promised his wife, Sarah, in their last conversation before his final tour, that he would come home and be a father, just a father. That was a promise he would die to keep. The next morning, the pressure ratcheted up, becoming a tangible, visible thing. Taped to their front door was a bright pink sheet of paper, an official eviction notice. Its color was grotesquely cheerful, a garish announcement of their failure for the entire building to see. It gave them 72 hours to vacate the premises, 72 hours to disappear. The sight of it made Arthur's stomach clench. It was a brand, a public declaration that they were unwanted, that they had fallen so far they were being cast out. Lily saw it when she opened the door to go to school. She stared at the bold, black letters, and though she couldn't understand all the legal jargon, she understood the finality of it. Her face crumpled, and she looked up at Arthur, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, what does that mean?" He knelt, pulling her into a hug, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "It means we're going to find a new, better place to live," he lied, his voice a rough whisper. "An adventure." She buried her face in his shoulder, unconvinced. The community's reaction was a silent, collective turning away. Mrs. Gable saw the notice from her window and quickly drew the blinds, as if their poverty were contagious. Mr. Chun, the kind-faced owner of the corner market where Arthur sometimes bought day-old bread, gave him a look of pity that felt sharper than any insult. Pity was a confirmation of his failure. The teenagers who hung around the complex snickered as he walked Lily to the bus stop, their whispers following him like smoke. No one offered a kind word. No one asked if he needed help. In their eyes, he was no longer a struggling neighbor. He was a problem about to be removed. Greg Henderson saw the notice and swaggered through the complex as if he'd won a championship. He felt emboldened, his cruelty validated by the official piece of paper. He found what he was looking for on the small concrete step outside Arthur's apartment. Lily's teddy bear, Barnaby. It was a threadbare thing, missing one button I loved nearly to pieces. It was her most prized possession, the last gift her mother had ever given her. Greg smirked, then deliberately kicked the bear off the step and into a muddy puddle left over from the morning's rain. He ground it into the muck with his heel before looking up, his eyes locking with Arthur's through the screen door. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, a cruel, triumphant twist of his lips. A cold, white-hot rage, the kind Arthur hadn't felt in years, surged through him. It was a familiar feeling, the battle-ready adrenaline that sharpened the senses and deadened the soul. For a split second, Sergeant Miller was back. But then he saw Lily's small, pale face reflected in the glass of the door, and the rage receded, leaving a hollow, aching grief in its place. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He opened the door, walked past Greg without a glance, and knelt by the puddle. With infinite gentleness, he picked up the soaked, mud-caked bear. He cradled it in his hands as if it were a wounded bird. His face was a stone mask, but inside, the dam he had so carefully constructed was cracking, water seeping through, threatening to unleash a devastating flood. The breaking point came later that day, not with a bang, but with the quiet, cruel words of a bully. Lily was sitting on the steps, trying to dry Barnaby's matted fur with a small towel, when Greg Henderson cornered her. Arthur was inside, on the phone with a social services office, the voice on the other end a monotone of bureaucratic indifference. He heard Greg's voice drift through the open window and a cold dread settled over him. "Playing with your little ratty bear?" Greg sneered, standing over Lily, blocking the sun. "You should throw that thing in the trash where it belongs. That's where you and your deadbeat dad are going to be living soon. In a cardboard box next to a dumpster." Lily flinched, pulling the bear closer to her chest. Her lower lip trembled. "He's not a deadbeat," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's my dad." "Yeah, well, your dad's a loser," Greg pressed on, enjoying her fear. "Can't even pay his rent. Can't protect his own kid." That was it. The line had been crossed. Arthur ended the call without a word and moved toward the door. When he stepped outside, the change in him was absolute. The weary, defeated janitor was gone. In his place stood something else, something older and far more dangerous. He didn't run or shout. He simply walked with a calm, deliberate purpose and placed himself directly between Greg and his daughter. He was a human shield. His posture had shifted. His shoulders were squared, his feet planted. The exhaustion had vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of glacial stillness. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the years of quiet suffering had been forged into a single, unassailable point of resolve. He looked at Greg, and his eyes, which were usually downcast and tired, were now clear, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. "Leave her alone," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried an impossible weight, a quiet authority that seemed to vibrate in the air. Each word was a heavy stone dropped into a silent pool. Greg was taken aback by the sudden transformation. He was used to a cowering, compliant victim. This was someone else. His surprise quickly curdled back into aggression. "Or what, old man?" he snarled, trying to reclaim his dominance. He shoved Arthur hard in the center of his chest, expecting him to stumble back as he had before. But this time Arthur didn't move. He didn't even brace himself. He simply absorbed the full force of the blow, his body as unyielding as an old oak tree. He didn't stagger. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Greg's, a silent testament to a will that would not be broken. He wasn't fighting back. He was enduring. He was showing Greg, and anyone watching, that you could hit him, you could push him, you could humiliate him, but you could not move him from his duty. He would stand there and take whatever punishment was meted out, because his daughter was behind him. It was the purest form of defiance, a selfless act of paternal love so profound it was almost terrifying to witness. He was a wall, and he would not crumble. The raw, quiet intensity of the confrontation had drawn a larger audience than before. Mrs. Gable was on her balcony again, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Mr. Chun had come out from his store, his broom idle in his hands. A few other tenants, drawn by the escalating tension, watched from their doorways and windows. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The passive judgment was gone, replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence. They had all seen Greg's shove. They had all seen Arthur absorb it without yielding an inch. It was like watching a man push against a mountain. They saw the look in Arthur's eyes as he shielded his daughter. It was not the vacant stare of a beaten man. It was the focused, primal glare of a guardian, a protector at his post. There was no anger in his expression, no hatred. There was only an infinite, immovable resolve. He was a father protecting his child, and in that moment he was the most powerful man any of them had ever seen. A whisper rustled through the onlookers. "Did you see that?" Mrs. Gable murmured to her husband, who had joined her on the balcony. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, like a wall of stone. Down below, Mr. Chun leaned on his broom, his brow furrowed. He had seen men get into fights outside his store before, drunken brawls loud and messy. This was different. This was not a fight. It was a testament. He had always seen Arthur as a quiet, downtrodden man, someone to be pitied. Now, seeing him stand as a silent bulwark against a loudmouthed bully, Mr. Chun felt a profound sense of respect, quickly followed by a hot wave of shame for his own prior judgment and inaction. He and the others had misread this man completely. They had mistaken quietness for weakness, stillness for defeat. They were beginning to understand that Arthur Miller's silence wasn't empty. It was full of a strength they couldn't possibly comprehend. The collective conscience of the small community began to stir, a slow, uncomfortable awakening to their own complicity. They had watched a good man be tormented, and they had done nothing. It started as a distant thrum, a vibration felt more in the chest than in the ears. The low, guttural rumble grew steadily, swelling into a ground-shaking roar that drowned out the chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic. Heads turned, searching for the source of the noise. Then they appeared. Turning onto the quiet, forgotten street was a procession of motorcycles, a river of chrome and black leather flowing into the decaying heart of the Oak View apartments. There were dozens of them, their engines a synchronized chorus of raw power. They belonged to the Iron Guardians Motorcycle Club, a group known throughout the county for their intimidating presence and their unspoken, ironclad code of conduct. They moved with a kind of military precision, fanning out and parking in a formidable line that effectively blocked the entrance to the complex. One by one, the engines were cut, the sudden silence ringing and heavy, charged with unspoken threat. The air grew thick with the smell of hot metal and exhaust. Men dismounted, large and imposing figures clad in worn leather vests adorned with the club's crest, a grim, stoic eagle. The residents of Oak View froze, their minor dramas forgotten. This was an intrusion from another world, a world of danger and consequence. At the center of the line was the club's president, a man known only as Reaper. He was older than the rest, his long beard streaked with gray, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. He swung his leg over his bike with a fluid grace that belied his size. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the scene. The trembling girl, the sneering bully, and the quiet, immovable man standing between them. It was then that Lily, propelled by a child's pure, desperate instinct, did the unthinkable. Her fear of Greg, amplified by the sudden arrival of these terrifying men, coalesced into a single, desperate act. She broke away from the safety of her father's shadow and ran, her small legs pumping, straight toward the most intimidating man she had ever seen. She ran right up to Reaper, her face streaked with tears, and grabbed a fistful of his leather vest. "Please!" she cried, her voice high and thin, cutting through the stunned silence. "Please, you have to help. He's going to kill my dad." She pointed a trembling finger back at Greg Henderson, who stood frozen, his smug expression having evaporated into slack-jawed disbelief. Every biker's head, in a slow, menacing pivot, turned to follow her finger. 20 pairs of hard eyes landed on Greg. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop 10 degrees. Reaper looked down at the terrified girl clinging to him, his expression unreadable. Then he lifted his gaze, past the bully, and settled it on Arthur. He looked at the man's stance, the way he held his ground, the quiet dignity that radiated from him even in this moment of crisis. And in that stance, in the set of his jaw, Reaper saw something hauntingly familiar, a ghost from another lifetime, from a world of sand and fire. Reaper's gaze was fixed on Arthur, a slow, dawning recognition flickering in his eyes. He gently detached Lily's hand from his vest, giving her a reassuring nod before he started walking. His boots were heavy on the cracked pavement, each step a deliberate, resonant thud that seemed to count down Greg Henderson's remaining moments of blissful ignorance. The crowd of onlookers held a collective breath. Greg, still puffed up with a pathetic, residual bravado, actually smirked, assuming this was about to get very interesting, and not for him. Reaper stopped directly in front of Arthur, standing so close they were almost chest to chest. The biker was larger, broader, a mountain of a man. But Arthur did not shrink. He met Reaper's intense gaze with his own quiet steadiness. Reaper's eyes scanned Arthur's face, taking in the tired lines, the weary set of his mouth, and then they stopped, zeroing in on a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. It was an old wound, almost invisible, but Reaper knew it as well as he knew the scars on his own hands. "Sergeant Miller?" Reaper's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. It was not a threat, but a question freighted with decades of history. "Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion." The name, the rank, the unit, it was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Arthur's stony composure finally fractured. A flicker of disbelief, of memory, of a past he had tried to bury, crossed his face. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Reaper?" he managed, his voice hoarse. "Private Jackson?" A slow, grim smile touched Reaper's lips. He had been a scared 19-year-old kid named Jackson then. Reaper was a name he earned later. He turned, not just to his men, but to the entire street, to the silent, watching neighbors. His voice, when he spoke again, was no longer a rumble. It was a roar, a proclamation that boomed across the courtyard, rattling windows and consciences alike. "This man," he said, pointing a thick finger at Arthur, "is Sergeant Arthur Miller. In Fallujah, he pulled 3 of my men, my brothers, out of a burning Humvee while we were taking heavy fire. He ran into the flames 3 times, his voice grew louder, thick with a furious, protective loyalty. He took a bullet that was meant for me. Right here, he jabbed a thumb at his own chest. It collapsed his lung and ended his career. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor, a medal he is too damn humble to ever talk about." Reaper took a step toward Greg, whose face had gone a ghastly, chalky white. "This man is a hero, a real goddamn American hero. And you people," he swept his arm in an arc, indicating the entire complex, the entire town. "You let this piece of garbage," he gestured at Greg with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, "put his hands on him? You let him be thrown out of his home." The story poured out of him. The details of Arthur's bravery, the sacrifices he'd made, the real reason for the slight limp he always dismissed as just getting old. The quiet janitor was gone, erased. In his place stood Sergeant Miller, a man forged in loyalty and fire. The transformation in the courtyard was instantaneous and absolute. Greg Henderson, who seconds before had been the apex predator of this small, sad kingdom, was now just a terrified boy. The Iron Guardians, without a word from Reaper, moved. They didn't charge. They simply flowed forward, forming a silent, menacing circle around him. They were a wall of leather, denim, and muscle. They didn't touch him, didn't speak to him. They just stood there, their very presence a suffocating promise of violence. Greg began to tremble, stammering apologies that no one heard or cared about. He looked for an escape, but there was none. Finally, Reaper gave a slight nod, and 2 of the bikers took a half-step back, creating a narrow path. Greg scrambled through it, stumbling over his own feet as he fled, his flight a pathetic, ignominious retreat. Reaper then turned his attention to Mr. Henderson, who had emerged from his office to see what the commotion was. Reaper met him on the steps, his shadow falling over the landlord. "Sergeant Miller's rent is taken care of," Reaper stated, his voice flat and cold. "From now on, it's covered by the Iron Guardian's benevolent fund. Indefinitely. And if his screen door so much as squeaks, if his faucet drips, if he gets so much as a cross-eyed look from you or your worthless son, you'll be dealing with me. Directly. Do you understand?" Henderson, pale and sweating, could only nod, his own authority utterly dismantled. The effect on the community was just as profound. A wave of shame, so thick it was almost visible, washed over the onlookers. They had been blind. Mrs. Gable hurried back into her apartment, her face flushed with guilt, and emerged minutes later with a steaming casserole dish, which she placed gently on Arthur's doorstep. Mr. Chun walked over from his store carrying a large cardboard box filled with groceries, bread, milk, eggs, fresh fruit. He pushed it into Arthur's hands, refusing any mention of payment. "For the sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Another neighbor, a man who ran a small contracting business, approached Arthur hesitantly. "I heard what he said," the man began, fumbling with his words. I could use a good man. Foreman. The pay is good. Real good. If you're interested, they had all seen a janitor, a failure. Now they saw a leader, a hero hidden in plain sight. The bikers didn't just make their point and leave. They stayed. Their presence transformed the apartment complex from a place of neglect into a fortress of respect. One of them, a burly man with a wrench, fixed the wobbly railing on the stairs. Another expertly repaired Arthur's torn screen door. They moved with a quiet, efficient purpose, their actions speaking louder than any words. Before they left, Reaper approached Arthur one last time. He held out a small, circular patch bearing the Iron Guardian's eagle crest. It wasn't the large patch members wore on their backs, but a smaller, more discreet one. "This is for your jacket, Sarge," Reaper said. "It's not an invitation. It's a statement. It means you're under our watch now. You and the little one. Your family." Arthur took the patch. His fingers closing around the stiff, embroidered fabric felt heavier than any metal. As dusk began to settle, painting the weeping sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, the bikers prepared to depart. The air in the courtyard, once thick with tension and shame, was now still and quiet, filled with a new, fragile kind of respect. Arthur stood on his small porch, Lily's hand held tightly in his. He was wearing his old, worn field jacket, the one he rarely took out of the closet. On the sleeve, sewn on with a few quick, deft stitches by one of the biker's old ladies, was the Iron Guardian's patch. It sat there, a small, dark circle of allegiance. Reaper mounted his bike, the leather creaking. He looked across the courtyard at Arthur. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other, two soldiers from different wars, different lives, who understood the unspoken language of sacrifice and loyalty. Reaper gave Arthur a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. Respect, gratitude, and a shared, unbreakable bond. Arthur, standing straighter than he had in years, returned the nod. Then, the engines roared to life in unison, a deafening, thunderous chorus. But the sound was no longer menacing. It was not the sound of a threat, but of a promise. It was the sound of protection, of a brotherhood rising to defend one of its own. The motorcycles pulled out, their taillights a string of red jewels disappearing into the twilight. As the last rumble faded, leaving a profound silence in its wake, Arthur looked down at Lily. The deep, weary lines around his eyes seemed to have softened, the haunted look replaced by a quiet, steady light of hope. The neighbors watched from their windows and doorways, no longer with pity or judgment, but with something akin to awe. The pink eviction notice, which had been torn from the door by one of the bikers and ground into the dirt, was gone. In its place was something invisible yet far more powerful. A shield of honor, forged in a forgotten war and delivered by a brotherhood of iron and leather. Arthur squeezed his daughter's hand, his touch a silent vow, a promise of safety now backed by an army of unlikely guardian angels. The grayness of Oakhaven felt, for the first time, a little less bleak.